right, well, welcome, everyone. My name's Joel Hammernick, and if you came to hear a talk on entrepreneurship, you're in the right room, and if that's not what you came to hear, you can find another room to be. Hopefully this will be a productive use of your time. I'm certainly glad to be here with you. Let me just open us up in a word of prayer, and then I'll jump in. Father, thanks just for this place, this physical place here in this city. Thank you that we can gather together in your name, that we can think carefully about how you're at work in this city and through this city and cities like it around the world, and we can ask important questions about what our role might be in that. Father, I pray that the day and our time here at the conference would be meaningful, that you would be at work in hearts and minds that are here. Some of us came here because we've been drinking the Kool-Aid for a long time, and for others this is new. And so whether this is old hat for us or whether this is brand new, I pray that your Spirit would speak in its powerful and unique way to each of us, that your name might be made great in this room, in this building, in this city, and through your people around the world. Pray that you just bless this time in Jesus' name. Amen. So what I'm going to sort of focus on, I'm going to sort of tell you the story. I live and work on the south side of Chicago, and I'm going to sort of unpack our story so that helps you understand why I would be thinking about entrepreneurship the way that I'm thinking about it and the way that we work with it. And while there are aspects of my interest that is very broadly speaking in entrepreneurship, I'm particularly interested in how entrepreneurship is an expression of love and of giftedness, and highly, highly relevant among our most disinvested, most marginalized neighborhoods, cities, places in the world. That's where my bias and my interest is. So I'm not going to tell you any stories about Steve Jobs or that kind of entrepreneur. My wife and I moved to Chicago in 1988, same year we got married, to go to Moody Bible Institute right down the street. And we have been in the city most of the years since then. We have 7 kids, and my second granddaughter was just born last week, so we have a growing family. I did not grow up in a place like Chicago. I really grew up in primarily suburban settings. But about 20 years ago, we joined the staff of a little organization called Sunshine Gospel Ministries. And Sunshine Gospel was a youth outreach into a neighborhood called Cabrini Green. Now, how many of you know what Cabrini Green is or was? Okay, well, that's higher than average. So you guys must pay attention to cities, or you're old, one or the other. And from Chicago, yeah. We host a lot of students on service learning groups, and if my average age dips below 35, almost nobody seems to know what Cabrini is anymore. But at one time, it was effectively Chicago, if not America's most notorious public housing community. It's only a couple of blocks from here. And the organization Sunshine Gospel was doing youth outreach at a very small scale in this neighborhood when I joined the staff in the 90s. And then the year I became the director in 2001, the city announced what they called the Plan for Transformation, which really meant that we as a city were going to tear down all of our public housing in the city, and except the senior buildings. But we had really, really mismanaged our public housing for decades, and it was a catastrophe. So the city went through over the next 10, 12 years and tore that down, and while I'm not here to talk to you about the story of violence, I will tell you that story about what we did with public housing is the backstory to the problems that we have with violence in our city over the past 10 or 15 years. Once the city began this process, or they announced the Plan for Transformation, we knew that the neighborhood we were serving would not exist in its current shape for long. They literally started building $1 million single-family homes in the middle of the projects, but before they tore them down. Like, that's how aggressive the speculation was. And so now, if you drive through, it's almost unrecognizable. So during that time frame, we were influenced. I would say I was influenced significantly by 2 voices. One was Martin Luther King and his vision for what he described as the beloved community. a world that we ought to live in that had an active stance against poverty, racism, marginalization, etc. And then the second voice that, for me, sort of brought tactics to thinking about the vision for the beloved community that Dr. King talked about was John Perkins, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And he talked about it, the way that I would say it is, the most effective way to work on the concept of the beloved community, the most practical way, is from within the community that you're trying to have an impact. And so my wife and I moved into a community on the south side of Chicago about 15 years ago and have raised our family there. When we moved, we were starting this organization that had been in Cabrini over, and so we started doing youth outreach programs for kids in 2nd grade through 5th grade. For the first 3 years, that's all we did. And then we added in middle school, and then we added in high school. And over that first decade or so, what we basically began to wrestle with was this idea that there's a correlation between the absence of work and the presence of violence in our community. And so we started paying attention to both sides of that equation. On the violence side, we were trying to say, what is the nature of the violence, and who's involved, and what are the best responses to it, and then what's our role as a small local stakeholder in getting involved in that. And so we've developed a variety of things. On the work side of the equation, I'm looking around a neighborhood that at a neighborhood level, the story of our neighborhood is sort of the story of Detroit. Right? Once upon a time, it was a white neighborhood, about 60,000 people. That would have been true in 1950. 10 years later, our neighborhood was an entirely African-American community, about 80,000 people. Today, it remains almost entirely African-American, but the population has dropped to 24,000. And so 2/3 of our neighborhood left. And when they left, it was the people with the wherewithal that left. Right? Like if you had money to get a mortgage and move to the suburbs in the 1970s as a middle-class black family in my neighborhood, most times you did, for a variety of reasons that are entirely understandable. But it left us with a community in which the entrepreneurs and the business owners and the most stable families and the families with the most means all left. And so we started asking, like, what's the nature of work in a place like this? How does opportunity start? We need jobs. What could we do? And when you start thinking about economic development and bringing jobs to an under-resourced community, in some ways the most visible strategies are what I would call the let's get a Walmart strategy, right? Let's just find a big piece of property that could be redeveloped, and let's find a big employer who will come in and provide 200 or 300 jobs in one fell swoop. And I'm not against that strategy necessarily, but I would have no idea how to do that. And we as a local stakeholder, as a small organization, a small faith-based ministry, we're not positioned to do something like that. So we began just asking questions around what is it that we could do? There was an abandoned building across the street from my office, and I kept looking at that building thinking, isn't there like somebody who could just open a little business there and just employ 2 or 3 people? Isn't there just something like that? And so we've ended up developing 3 different strategies, only one of which I'm going to really spend much time on, so I'll just mention the other 2 in passing. We did end up raising a small fund, a private equity fund, and opening a cafe. We found that was one way to get investors to come in. We couldn't find anybody who would open a coffee shop. We couldn't find anybody who would open a cafe. What we could find is 10 or 12 families that would split a small investment, and together they would put some money in a place where someone else could start a cafe, and we facilitated that. Another aspect that we did was we started a summer job program, because what we found is that when you hire a kid at 17, 18, 19, 20 years old who's never had a job before, you're not actually giving them a job when you hire them. What you're doing is you're teaching them how to work. They're not, I want to say this charitably, please hear what I'm intending to say. They're not worth the money that you're paying them because they haven't learned how to do the job. So you're paying them in spite of the fact that there's not the value proposition is the investment in their life and the idea that this is their first job before their next job. The value is not, can they mow lawns competitively with somebody else down the street who's been mowing lawns for 15 years. That's just not going to happen. So the workforce development aspect of a hiring jobs program was one. The cafe was one. But then the other observation that we'd made all along is that we operated out of having been influenced both by a Christian vision that says people are fundamentally gifted. The place where people have the most room for growth in their life is out of the gifts that God has given them, right? Like just an underlying belief. There's an interesting, if you pay attention to community development language, there's an interesting sort of philosophy that's more in a secular context called ABCD, asset-based community development. And there's two professors from Northwestern here in town who have developed this language around, if you're going to go into a disinvested community and you're going to get to work, start with the assets. Don't start with the deficits. Don't start with what's wrong. Start with what's there that's valuable. And that always resonated very, very strongly to me. But I couldn't often, other than like doing our youth work, I couldn't quite figure out how to grab hold of that in a practical, functional way. And so as we were thinking about this question about what's the nature of work and how does it come about and what could we do as a local stakeholder, we began paying attention to the idea that there were actually a lot of people in our neighborhood doing something of value and earning a little bit of money from it. And when you in the neighborhood, the language is you have a little hustle, you have a little gig, you have a little side job, you have that kind of thing going on. And of course, if you're not from the neighborhood, you hear that, and then a lot of people immediately think, well, yeah, there's drug dealing. They're like, yeah, we know what that is. It's like, no. The off-the-books economy or the underground economy or the shadow economy is mostly very legitimate activity doing in a way that has not been legitimated, right? So if you cut hair every Friday night in your back bedroom, that's a completely legitimate form of work, right? Millions of people around the world create a living for themselves by doing other people's hair. Totally legitimate. But you're operating in your bedroom. You have no license. You have no insurance. You're not doing anything in terms of like record keeping. You're certainly not paying taxes on it, those kind of things. So in that sense, it's legitimate work that has not been legitimated. And when you start paying attention to that kind of work in a community like mine, what you realize is almost everybody is doing something because their main form of income is not enough to pay the bills. And so if your main form of income is some combination of child support or a minimum wage job or some of the other social welfare programs that create, a little bit of residual income or pay for your groceries or whatever, you're almost never able to survive on that, so you start doing something separately. And when you then start thinking about entrepreneurship in general, what you recognize is, or what the studies would tell you is this, about 5 to 7% of the population, pretty much anywhere, are generally considered to be entrepreneurial people. They're sort of swim-to-shore folks. We all know them. We see them around us. They start something. It doesn't work out. Then they start something else. Entrepreneurs pretty much never start only one thing. They are not people who have one idea. Entrepreneurs are generally people who have recurring ideas and experiments that they're working on. And it turns out that entrepreneurs in immigrant communities, returning citizen communities, and among high school dropouts all start businesses at a higher rate than the general population. So when you think about a community like ours, then it would be safe to assume that something like 5 to 10% of the people in our neighborhood are probably either genuinely legitimate entrepreneurs, or at the very least they have an idea and they're motivated enough that if they had some support, they could be doing what it is that they do better. Most folks in our neighborhood that start these ideas are starting them in the underground economy, which means they're using the least efficient forms of capital. They're using little or no sort of marketplace typical skills and knowledge and understanding. And so we saw that as a place to come alongside of those folks. We felt like what we could do is we could sort of pull together some basic business fundamentals. I'm kind of an entrepreneur. My mom was an entrepreneur. I could sort of see some of the missing pieces. And it's like, what is record keeping? And what is bookkeeping? And what is cash flow? And what is the concept of break even? Even very successful entrepreneurs rarely actually know what their break-even point is, but it's a super important thing to know, right? It's the tipping point where you go from losing money doing what you're doing to making money doing what you're doing. And that, like, but believe me, the first time somebody sees that on a piece of paper, it's like, it's a nirvana moment. Like, wow, if I priced it $1 higher, it's the difference between me losing money and making money. So those kind of things, basic marketing, basic legal, that's what we thought we would package together. We put together a cohort of our first folks. We set up in the fall of 2012, we set up our first day to announce that we were going to run this thing called Sunshine Enterprises, which was going to be a class for neighborhood entrepreneurs to help them grow their business. That was scheduled for a Saturday. The night before, Friday night, I got invited to go to an event at Willow Creek out in the suburbs, and I got to hear, it was a whole conference, so there's a lot of different people, but there were two people that stood out to me. This woman named Alpha Demilish, who's a Ethiopian immigrant living in New Jersey, and her husband, Alex Forrester. And they explained what they were doing, and they were doing exactly what we wanted to do, but they were Harvard grads, and they were 10 years ahead of us. And so I got myself invited to dinner with them. And then over the next year, I made 5 or 6 trips to New Jersey to say, what are you doing and why does it work? And I was delighted to find out that they were on Martin Luther King Drive in Jersey City, because we're a block off Martin Luther King Drive on the south side of Chicago. Same neighborhood, different city. And what we found was that we had that Alpha and Alex were not only incredibly good at what they did, but we were kindred spirits in our underlying assumptions about the value of the people that we were working with and the importance of the work that they were doing. When you get a glimpse of love as the framing descriptor or the defining tool for doing this kind of work, it changes your thought process about sort of capitalism and business development. You realize that at a very granular level, at a very human level, entrepreneurship is an expression of one's giftedness and one's love. And when you talk to our entrepreneurs, what you'll find out is, yes, they have an idea that's a business idea. All entrepreneurs will do this. Almost all entrepreneurship comes as a result of solving a problem of some kind. The difference in a community like ours is that the entrepreneur will almost always express a solution that they've come to and a way that they want that to change their community. So we have lots of women in skin and hair care products, for instance. So one of our entrepreneurs that's now selling in several Whole Foods, her hair fell out. And she worked and developed a scalp salve that is unique to African American women, and it literally helped regrow her hair, and she's turned that into a life-transforming business for her and for her family. And on the side, she's helping entrepreneurs that are not as far along as she is. Almost all of our entrepreneurs develop this language. Let me back up and just on the sort of why of it, because the why, if you miss the why and you get caught up in the how, I think you'll lose sight of why it's important and maybe even become overwhelmed with the difficulty of the work. But let me go back and just tell you a little story that goes to the why. So this gal this friend of mine, Alpha, that I just mentioned, when she was 2 years old, she lived in Ethiopia, and the country descended into complete chaos. They started executing all of the educated people, and including some of her family members. And her family, along with Alpha, ended up in a refugee camp. And her mom managed to get a green card and come to the United States. So she landed in Boston, left her daughter in Ethiopia, outside of Addis Ababa, and her mom got a job as a waitress. And that was she earned just enough money to pay the bills to keep the rent paid. But, of course, her real dream was to be reunited with her daughter. So she started a seamstress business, sewing gowns in her back bedroom. It took her 10 years to save enough money to be reunited with Alpha. So Alpha came to the United States at 12 years old, speaking no English. By the time she graduated high school, she got into Harvard. And that set her on a trajectory to go on to do what she's done now. She's now like a Davos young global leader, and invited to the White House by President Obama, and she's hard to keep up with at this point. But one of the things that she said, a couple of things that she said about just thinking about her story is this. Number one, Alpha's never met a more successful entrepreneur than her mom, as far as she's concerned. But if her mom, during that 10 years, would have sat down with a banker, she'd have felt stupid. And the banker would have thought she was stupid. And the banker would not have been able to understand the value proposition of what she was doing. When we think of the giftedness of people and we recognize that there are dreams, this is not just about money, right? This is about life, and it's about an expression of who you are. It's about using your gifts. When we see that with our entrepreneur, it then doesn't matter if your revenue is $200 a month or $2,000 a month or $20,000 a month. It doesn't, the question is, are you building what you want to build? Are you using your gifts? Are you using what God has given you to impact the world? And then where do you want to go? And if someone says to me, my goal is to put my child in a private school, and to do that I need to earn $10,000 a year in household income, that sounds like a very wonderful business plan to me. That's a legitimate business. Right down the school from us is the Booth, University of Chicago Booth School. And at Booth, a $10,000 a year revenue stream does not sound much like a business, right? But for us it does, and it's transformative. The other thing that's valuable about thinking about it that way is that you can work at a certain scale. According to the U.S. Census, for every black-owned business in the United States that has one or more employee, there are 20 that have no employees. So most black-owned businesses don't have any employees. So that's like a solo entrepreneur, right? But the way it gets counted there is that that's a legitimated business. That's a business license of some kind. I would suspect that there's another 20-to-1 ratio for non-legitimated businesses within my community. In other words, we don't have to just cherry pick 5 or 10 employers that we could support. We can work at the scale of hundreds or thousands of people cultivating their entrepreneurship opportunities, skills, gifts. And because entrepreneurs typically have a powerful impact on their children, as that child who's growing up in the home sees this happening in the context of mom doing, dad fixing cars, or mom doing hair, or baking pies, or they're planning parties, or painting murals, or watching children, or it's like a lengthy list of ideas that people have. There's something fundamental that's happening there. And so I would say that the other value of understanding entrepreneurship that way is that entrepreneurs tend to be leaders. And they tend to be people who are unrecognized for their leadership. But when you pour in and you stick to it and you work on that little idea, very often in neighborhoods like ours, people are looking, there's two different things that happen with leadership. One is people look to outside of the community for leaders, or there's like this gatekeeper effect where there's just a few people in the neighborhood who seem to control everything. And the idea of seeding vision and encouragement and power at scale into entrepreneurs throughout our community. The exciting thing for me is that I see this as this generation of leaders. And most of our entrepreneurs are in their 30s and 40s. We're not working with children. But when you light the fire under somebody and you say to them, that is a good idea, that is good work, that's important work, how can we support that? What you see is this level of courage that gets built. So we don't teach anything that you couldn't learn. I'll give you sort of numbers in terms of scale, in terms of how we're working, and then some of the tactics that in terms of how we do it. We don't teach anything that you couldn't learn on the internet. So in a sense, this is cultivation of entrepreneurship is not largely about the knowledge itself per se. It's about the knowledge being set in a context which people can receive it and they can sort of work through that. So we are now replicating what Rising Tide is doing in New Jersey. We've been at the first year we ran our own stuff. After the end of the first year, we've been doing exactly what they're doing. So if you go to one of our community business academies, or you were to go to New Jersey and go to one of theirs, you'd see exactly the same thing. So we recruit 15 to 20 people at a time. They participate in the Community Business Academy, which is a 12-week curriculum. We meet once a week for 3 hours. So it's typically 6 to 9 in the evenings during the weeknights, and then we run a Saturday class that runs from 9 to noon up on the north side. once those students go through, well, in the context of the Community Business Academy, what we're doing is we are communicating this basic knowledge about record keeping and bookkeeping and understanding how all of our entrepreneurs think everyone in the world is their customer when we start. This is a classic entrepreneur thing. So we talk about market strategy. One of our evenings we do when we introduce marketing, we'll go visit 2 pizza shops, right? We'll go to some place like Giordano's, and then we'll go to some place like Papa John's. Right, and just begin to talk about what's the difference they're both selling pizza. Pretty much the ingredients are pretty much the same, right? But your experience and your customer and your price point, all of those are completely different. And we'll do these kind of things that get our entrepreneurs thinking about, so what is their idea? So while we have the students together over that 12 weeks, they're learning together about entrepreneurship in general and these principles in general. They are not working on their business during the 12 weeks. Because what you have to do is maintain a level of trust in the room. And in some ways, in communities like ours, this is actually the secret sauce. Does the person coming into the room feel safe? Do they trust you? Will they allow you to know what they know and what they don't know? Right? Will they take some risk? Because if they won't allow you to do that, they're not going to learn much. But if they do open up, and then they're hurt by the response. So if my business is $200 a month, and I'm sitting next to someone who's doing $2,000 a month, it would be very easy for me to be left feeling stupid, right? And so guarding against that, which means you've got to pay attention to how the room is handled, how you recruit, how your instructors work, but maintaining a level of love and respect and trust in that room is really important. There's a level of courage that goes along with entrepreneurship in general, and then in a sense there's even a higher level of courage for folks in this room. If you're an entrepreneur in my CBA and you have a lawn mowing business, and you come home and you have $100 in cash in your pocket because you just mowed somebody's lawn or a couple of lawns and you got paid, and you can see that the kid next door doesn't have shoes, and the next day is the first day of school. There's a lot of pressure on you in that moment to think compassionately and responsibly, and to think to yourself, I have $100 in my pocket. There's somebody who has a really significant need right next to me. I should do something about that. But if you're thinking as a business person, and you know that your margins are about 10%, then you know actually you don't have $100 in your pocket. You really have $10 in your pocket, in effect. Right? And if you've thought about the idea that you need a new lawnmower to mow that next, it's a courageous decision to make those choices in that context. If you're in a marginalized and a disinvested and a poor community, somebody who gets just a little bit of success might just look like a little bit of success to you, but it might look like colossal success to the neighbor. And being able to have a way to think through those kinds of difficult decisions is what gets established in that room. So you're learning the mechanics of what's going on. You're establishing a set of trust, and then what we would say is this: you're learning knowledge capital, or you're adding some knowledge capital. If your skill is baking pies, you have that specific knowledge. We are adding a level of technical knowledge around record keeping and bookkeeping and pricing and negotiating and those kinds of things. But you're also in need of social capital. And the social capital is the value of the other people in the room who are in similar situations to what you're in. And they're making similar difficult decisions. And entrepreneurship is typically a pretty lonely thing. And so the value of what's happening in that room is incredibly valuable. But there's a second set of social capital that we have an opportunity to introduce to that group of folks, and that is that most of them have actually never sat down with a banker or a lawyer or a marketing person or a website designer, etc. And we, of course, know lots of people that do that. And so what we do is we bring into the context of the Community Business Academy an opportunity just to interact in a very human way with a few people like that. Bankers are not. Turns out bankers usually are not actually scary people. They're just people. But if you've never had that, so there's value in being able to say, I actually know a banker, right? So if you have a banking question, you have somebody that you can call. And so we facilitate both the internal social capital and the external social capital. So that's really what's happening in the 12 weeks. Once folks graduate, we then offer everyone one-on-one coaching and mentoring. And then our conversation with our entrepreneurs shifts to those unique entrepreneurs and their unique ideas. And what are the next 2 or 3 things they should be doing? Because this is where most entrepreneurs operate. Most entrepreneurs do not plan. And actually, to be honest, most of them don't need to plan per se. They need to do the next right thing. And so we are very focused on their what we call action plans once they graduate and saying, what are the next 2 or 3 things you need to do? For most of our folks, almost everybody, it means working on their personal credit. For some of them, it means getting a job. Most entrepreneurs have a job and then start a business anywhere in the world, not just like in places like this, right? Like even in very, very wealthy communities, a Booth graduate usually goes and gets a job and then starts the business on the side. That's just the way entrepreneurship usually works, and most people don't recognize that. So as our entrepreneurs are going through, the other thing we've begun tracking is we have a surprisingly high rate of people who get a better job while they're in the CBA or shortly after. And we see a tick up in household income, not only from building their business, but they become better employees, they better understand the nature of work and as an employee, and then they also understand, because we deal with this in budgeting and credit, is that the best money out there is your money. Right? Like it's the cheapest. So if you earn a couple extra bucks an hour at your job, you can put that into your business. You don't have to pay anybody any interest rate on it. You don't even have to fill out an application. So the Community Business Academy lays the groundwork. When they graduate, we shift to coaching and mentoring. And then what we would say is this. Because all of everything I've explained so far is under the general heading of technical assistance. When people talk about entrepreneurs in disinvested neighborhoods, usually the conversation starts off with access to capital. And access to capital is a significant issue, but what I would say is this. You have to think about both of these buckets appropriately. There's capital, there's access to capital, and then there's technical assistance. And most people who say they need access to capital, they do, but first they need technical assistance. One of the places this becomes very obvious is if you go to pitch competition. So if you're paying to entrepreneurship, pitch competitions are an exciting thing that they happen all over the city. I'm sure they happen where you are. And if you go and you actually sit through and you listen not just to the 2 or 3 that end up winning, but if you listen to, let's say, the top 10, what you realize is that most of the people who are presenting their idea don't actually need the money. Mostly, they need help with their idea. Their idea, they don't know what their revenue stream is. They don't know what the distinctiveness of their business is. They don't have their production worked out. They don't have their marketing worked out. They need this other stuff that when that's worked out, it will better position them for access to capital. So it's, again, I'm not downplaying the need for capital. I'm just saying much of the need is on the technical assistance side. The nice thing about that is that if you're thinking about supporting entrepreneurs, that would suggest you don't need tons of money. You need time and a level of expertise, a level of engagement, a level of trust, of love, of encouragement, and then there's money out there. And so to that point, there's actually a lot of money out there. And in the last 10 years, at least in the United States, the lending pools of capital have matured significantly. 10 or 15 years ago, if you wanted a loan to start a business, a small business that was like, let's say, between $2,000 and $5,000, you had traditional banks that didn't want to give you that loan because they only lose money on loans of that size. You had credit cards, and you had predatory lenders, and that was just about it. Today, in the city of Chicago, there's probably at least 20 different places that you could go get some form of capital between $2,000 and $5,000. Traditional banks have credit builder products that are growing. You have Kiva and other forms of crowdfunding. You have Axion and other forms of lending funds that are intentionally set to target low-income and minority communities to get capital flowing. There's actually a fair amount of capital out there. And what I would say is this: there are 2 things that are a high predictor of your ability to get capital as an entrepreneur. One is decent credit, because almost every small business loan is actually a personal loan. There are very, very few business loans that are business loans per se. Most entrepreneurs get started with personal loans. So I'm sorry, did I say that right? Most business loans to new entrepreneurs are not business loans per se, they're personal loans. And so if you have decent credit, that's one key thing. And the other is if you just have reasonable financial documents. And almost no one that we start with has reasonable financial documents. Are any of you familiar with the Goldman Sachs 10,000 Small Business Program?
I'm a graduate.
Okay. So I went through that as well a few years ago. There were 30. The Goldman Sachs program is a lot. In some ways, it's a lot like what I just discussed, minus the love part.
Agreed.
And the average revenue for a business owner going through Goldman Sachs is $1 million a year in revenue. That's where they target. I went through with 30 other business owners, and there were 2 people in the room that knew how to read their financial statements. At $1 million a year in revenue, I was like, wow, this is not that different than what we do on the South Side. So if you think about it this way, almost all of our entrepreneurs, when they come to us, if they were to go to a bank or even to one of these alternative lenders that I just spoke about, they would virtually all get turned down. And if you view the world in the lens of who's ready for capital, the number's really, really low. But that's a little bit like, do you have an employee or not? Just because you don't have an employee now doesn't mean you can't have an employee in the future, right? Just because you're not ready for the loan now doesn't mean you can't be ready in the future. What do you need? It's actually pretty predictable. You need decent credit, and you need decent financials. Cash flow and collateral are helpful, but honestly, even those are not 100% mandatory given where the market is going right now for access to capital. But decent financials, and even very simple financials, but accurate, and decent credit will get you there. So our disposition to our entrepreneurs is, it doesn't matter to us if you can't get a loan right now. The question is, what do you want to do with your idea? Because we believe over time you could be ready. Our friends at Rising Tide in New Jersey ended up telling us that it takes, on average, 3 years from the time somebody graduates from the business academy to the time they're ready for what you would think of as a regular loan. So most entrepreneurship support tends to be aimed at a very narrow timeline. Can we do an 8 or 10 or 12-week cohort of some kind and then go get them a loan and get them a business and go on to the next group? And it doesn't really work that way. It takes a long time to work through this and to see people go into it. So we're 5 years in. I'll go like 3 or 4 more minutes and then we can just do Q&A. We're about 5 years in. We have our 38th cohort right now going. We're running 5, so we have a number of 34 through 38 going right now. We have about 100 folks in our Community Business Academy. When they graduate at the end of the year, our cumulative total will be right around 600 people that have graduated from the program in the last 5 years. We're on pace to we'll serve about 300 unique entrepreneurs. So that's about 160 people total that took the Community Business Academy this year. And then not only are they then going to get included in our coaching count, but we have people from previous years. And there's like a half-life, obviously. Not everybody takes up the coaching. In the second year, your number drops pretty significantly below that. But the cumulative number of people that are involved either in the Community Business Academy on an annual basis or in the ongoing coaching and mentoring for us has reached about 300 roughly right now. We're planning to grow that to a scale point of about 750 annually. We work in 3 different neighborhoods around the city, south side, west side, and then on the northwest side, if anybody's familiar with the city, the first suburb north of the city is Evanston, which is generally viewed as a very affluent neighborhood. It does have an African-American part of Evanston, which is, compared to the area of median income, quite low income, and we've been operating there for 3 years, and it's been fantastic up there. Our in-business rate is right at 50%, meaning about 50% of all of the people who've ever gone through our Community Business Academy are in business. So that's about 300 people at this point that we're supporting. We consider you in business if you are actually making sales and getting paid for it. So if you come to us and you've been cutting hair for 20 years but you've never charged anybody, we would, and then you start charging somebody, we would consider you to have started a business. If you and therefore in business, we don't set a minimum threshold. We don't actually care what the revenue number is. These terms all become relevant in different contexts, whether it's fundraising or understanding what it means to support people. We track in business, jobs created, increase in household revenue. We've begun tracking home purchases. So we sort of discovered inadvertently that like a bunch of our people, like after they went through the credit thing, went out and bought a house. We started, what else did we start? Getting a better job. We've started tracking that. Anyway, so one word of summary, and then we can just take questions. What I would say is this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but I would say that our typical client is a 30-something-year-old African-American single mother of two who's living on less than $30,000 a year. If she can generate $12,000 to $15,000 in annual household income, it will take her family out of poverty. So that's like our value proposition right there. And it's really fun when you get people who are operating a lot above that, and we're thrilled to do that when people build bigger businesses. But our value proposition is seeing this expression of your gift, expression of what you're good at, priced fairly, delivered well, as a mechanism to take your family out of poverty, to bless your children. That's super powerful, and I would be happy to stay with that as the definition of the people that we're serving in our community. So we've got 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, question. So back to your example about the underground economy.
Yep.
Right, to cut the hair back. What I'm wondering is, from that person's perspective, what's the value proposition to join the CDA as you go to recruit those guys, especially given what you just said about capital? Capital's probably 3 years out.
Yeah.
So what's the value proposition to him? Like, why does he want to do that?
Yeah, good question. So I think for most of our entrepreneurs, they've never had somebody come alongside of them and say, that's valuable work. What's your dream? Could we help you get there? And we started doing marketing like on the CTA and stuff like that, and we stopped because it doesn't work. Our marketing is all word of mouth. So once somebody's gone through the program and they tell two or three of their friends who they know have ideas like this, that's really where the encouragement comes. And that when we do alumni events or whatever, like the encouragement and the excitement that comes in that context is just like, it's so invigorating to be in those rooms. And so we'll invite new prospective clients into some of those environments, some of the graduations, stuff like that. And some of our people have like legitimately like really big dreams. They do really want to build something that's really big. And if they see this as a way to help them get there, then that's great. I think most entrepreneurs, though, like you have to put yourself out there, right? There's some risk in putting yourself out there about what your dream is, and it doesn't usually work the first time. So that I feel like it's at that kind of fulcrum point in a way that we get a lot of people. They're like, we took the chance, it didn't work, I'm feeling sheepish about this, and they sit down in the interview process and are affirmed for the nature of the work that they're doing. I think it really wins people over. Do you need to slip? Oh yeah.
I'm sorry.
No problem. Thanks. Anybody else?
With what you're doing with the Sunshine Enterprise, how does that fit, or does it fit, with a local church? So you have a local church, to where a local church is in what's considered a very urban community. How does the church then create something like this? Do they create it through the gifts of the folks that are in their church, or do they separate that out and create a arm that would be a CDC?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, you have to solve for that locally and very uniquely to your context and who's in your church. But when I started wrestling with this question, right, this equation about the absence of work and the presence of violence, and starting to think about work, I spent a couple of years reading like everything I could get my hands on around sort of faith and works, economics, business development, et cetera. And one of the things that I discovered was that we generally approach business people that are in our congregations for their gifts. And what I mean by that is, would you please write a check? Right? Like we tend to see them like that as the value. When in fact, that's like giving. I'm not at all convinced that the average successful businessman's central spiritual gift is the gift of giving. It's probably something more like the gift of building a business. And in my conversations with business people over these years that we've been paying more and more attention to that, believe me, they feel that. And the idea that this would give a mechanism for a Christian businessman to help someone build their dream, foster the growth of a local business. There's enormous sort of space to see that happen. So we have, once we go through coaching and mentoring, we now have 10 staff that run Sunshine Enterprises, but we couldn't possibly be able to deliver all of the coaching and mentoring long term. I mean, if we're going to grow our scale point to serving more than 700 entrepreneurs a year, I could never raise enough money to pay all my coaches. So finding Christian business people that will be involved as coaches and mentors is an important part of that. I would say, a lot of the early stuff that I said about really being able to see and value the local, the gift that the person has, regardless of the size of the business, that's the one thing that you have to do some kind of, you have to be careful. And also the other thing is that in the church, in bringing the business community into thinking about the impact that they could have here, is that not all businesses, not all business people are entrepreneurs. It's very different to be an entrepreneur than it is to work at like middle management in corporate America. So there's an organization across the country called SCORE, which is basically volunteer retired executives who do mentoring. And my experience has been pretty much terrible with them, because a retired executive is not a neighborhood entrepreneur, right? Like there's such a drastic cultural gap that we've sort of built our own mentoring program as a result of that. And we have a couple of business leaders who really get it, who bring the other business people in and make sure they get it. We've had some nightmarish. I had a volunteer mentor tell my staff they didn't know what they were doing, and he was the real business leader, and he would be taking over from them. So, he not only made our clients feel stupid, he made my staff feel stupid, and so needless to say, I don't let him in the building. I think watching those kind of things, but I'll say one other thing about that I think is just so important. So I ran a youth ministry in the inner city on the south side of Chicago for 10 years. We restored this old building. I think it's a beautiful building, classic Chicago architecture. But then when we opened up that cafe across the street, little space, beautiful, good coffee, good food, I met more people in that cafe in 1 year than I had in the previous 10 years combined in the youth ministry space. That business opened up our community to us. It opened up the university, including students, to us. The value of that business to our block and even to our ministry is it's almost incalculable. It's just bizarre, and I didn't see that coming. So I just think there's actually a lot of room for finding the value of business as an expression of the giftedness of God for our vocational calling and our design to cultivate the earth that we miss. And to me, this whole topic just opens up a lot to think about there. And if you go from there, then you can figure out what the organizational structure is, I think.
Over the 5 years, you talk about 600 people. How many have either dropped out or have you turned to,
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit to the process of how you do the recruiting and under what circumstances someone might not qualify to be a part of the program?
Sure. So our overall dropout rate's like 10 to 15% typically. That's the long-term number at Rising Tide in New Jersey, so we've gotten pretty close to that. It started higher because when we started, we would take anybody. It's the nature of starting stuff like this. Oh, you have a business idea? Yeah, we didn't have our own marketing. That's right. And we didn't have a track record, so we couldn't say, see how good we've been at this? So we took anybody. So we took people who we definitely shouldn't have taken, and we got slowly tighter. We didn't even fix that in the first year. It just slowly got better. But here's what I would say. We don't take people with multi-level marketing ideas. If you woke up in the middle of the night and watched an ad for selling acacia berries to all of your friends and relatives to make a business, we won't take you. We're looking for somebody who has a business idea that ties into their life story that suggests to us that they have a shot at this thing and that they're serious about it. So if you say, I grew up in a home and my dad fixed cars and I would really like to start a car repair business, we're like, oh, that totally makes sense, right? There's got to be something. Or even, I have a corporate job. We have this too. I have a corporate job. I don't like the environment, but I've always watched children on the weekends. I'm thinking about opening a daycare like in my home and make it a full-time job. We would totally take that. So it's really, you're looking for somebody who demonstrates some form of genuine entrepreneurship. You're looking for someone who has something about their story that suggests that they know enough about this idea to work on it seriously. We also charge. We charge $300 for people to take the class. It costs us more than 10 times that. It costs us on average around $4,000 or $5,000 per entrepreneur over the course of the year. So our budget's $1 million. And we're going to serve 300 entrepreneurs this year, right? So you just do a straight division, you realize it's a lot of money. We'll lower that $300 materials fee that we charge as low as $50. We will not go below $50. And we'll do that based on income, and we'll sort of hear people's story, and we'll let them pay that over the 12 weeks. But if you don't have $50 you can come up with, you're not that serious about your business idea. So that's one way of screening people out. Another mistake that a lot of people make is they start by saying, if you take this program, there's loan available for you. If you talk about money to get people in your class, you'll have the wrong people in your class. And one of our banks actually came to us. Banks and financial institutions all operate under this Community and Reinvestment Act. It's called CRA. They all get a federally regulated CRA score. And if they haven't been lending and investing in neighborhoods like these, they get pressure from the federal government. Sometimes it can be really significant. So one of our local banks is under a ton of pressure. So they came to us and they said, we have this great loan product, $5,000 to $10,000. We'll do line of credit. We'll do term loan. We'll do whatever you want, 6%, no fee, which means that even in a successful repayment of that loan, they lose money on everyone. Because a bank cannot service a $5,000, 6% no fee loan and not lose money. And they said to us, we'll give it to every person who takes your class. I said, oh, no, you will not. And we will not tell anybody that either. We only want you to give that loan to someone that we're convinced will pay you back. Because it's not in anybody else's interest to do that. And so there's another organization in the city that this same bank said the same thing to, and they recruited, they had, come take our class, get a $5,000 loan at the end of it. And they immediately filled their class. But the success rate on those loans was just really, really low. So thinking about what your incentives are, it has to be much more about who the person is, what the dream is, where are they, those kind of things.
Thank you. Good work.
Yeah. To do. It is.
The Initiative for Competitive Intercity is also similar to the bachelor program.
Yeah.
I've just been watching these kinds of things because I care a lot about social justice and people prospering. So two questions. One is how does trauma affect? I would imagine these neighborhoods trauma is pretty significant. Mm-hmm. And how do you address that when you bring this kind of work? And then the other is, have you considered turning? I think of drug dealers as marketplace leaders in a sense too. Can we somehow have you considered pathways to help them to turn that into a different kind of enterprise,
yeah.
if you will? Because there's a lot of skill involved with that business.
There is.
And it would be incredible if you could,
if you can relax that on. So drug dealers as entrepreneurs, we haven't taken any that I know of.
Because we're the men, right? Like I know that women are starting businesses at a faster rate than men.
Yeah, we're about 75% women, 90% African American. We just started a program for returning citizens where we're integrating. So we took about 40 out of our 160 CBA graduates this year. About 40 of them, maybe not quite that, 25 of them, something like that, are people who are literally just coming out of the Illinois Department of Corrections. So I don't know that it narrows down to this fine point. Freakonomics theory on drug dealers as business leaders is really, really interesting. But this goes back to the previous question. We also don't take people who have ideas that we don't think are good for the neighborhood. So we wouldn't do a marijuana dispensary. We wouldn't do a massage parlor. Stuff like that. And I just lost track. The first part of the question was
trauma. Question about
trauma. Yeah.
The second question really is where are the men?
Yeah. So in our case, the men are very often tied up in the judicial system in one way or another, prison, parole, etc. And so we are trying to figure out how to be much more direct. And what really our conclusion is we need to deliver the services before pre-release. to really hang on to the guys that are coming back from the Department of Corrections, and so we're working on that. I think a lot of the language that I said around sort of social capital and trust and courage, all of that is doubly important because of the level of trauma in our community. All of our children know somebody who's been killed. In fact, in our particular community, almost all of our teenagers know someone that has been killed by the police. And so they, like the ripple effect of trauma. Violence, you often think of violence as an instance, but violence is not, it's not a sole point in time, right? It works its way out in your life, in your community over time, and it shows itself up through trauma in different ways throughout. So I think having instructors, having even in the recruitment phase, people that are sensitive to that and are interacting in a way that is I guess just mindful that I mean, so when somebody's late for work or late for class or slow to respond, we don't run it with like sort of wrap people on the knuckles for not doing exactly what we told them to do. We recognize there's a lot going on in their life, and sometimes that will derail the whole idea for a while, which is fine, right? Like you could skip a year and come back to your idea. We're going to be here. That's kind of the way that we approach it. We also actually happen to have a clinician on our staff. So one of our entrepreneur instructors herself came to us just finishing her degree as a counselor, wanting to start her own counseling business. And actually she's done it, but now she runs it in a part-time way and then works for us full-time. And so we have somebody who's on site that we actually turn to a lot. I bet you we have a conversation with her once a week about a particular situation we're trying to address. We've had a number of children, like parents who are in our class have a children that's been killed in the last 5 years, so it's very proximate to us.
And do you, because of a gospel-centered ministry, you're sharing that the hope of the gospel within the context of the business enterprise coaching, counseling, whatever. Yeah.
Great point. I'm glad you brought that up. So. We really wrestled with this, and actually I also there's an organization called Partners Worldwide that sets up coaches and mentors among Christian business leaders, and they do it all over the world, and they're growing their work in the United States. And actually the guy that's leading their work in the United States is a guy named Ethan Daly, who was on my staff for the past 4.5 years. He just left to go lead that work for Partners. And in terms of getting successful business people, Christians, overtly Christian in their message around business cultivation, Partners is, I think, among the best in the country. We are actually not. We do not. Sunshine Enterprises is not a faith-based work. So we do not speak specifically about our faith. All of our staff are Christians. All of our board members are Christians. And at every one of our graduations, when we have a few graduates go up, they almost all talk about Jesus. So it's not explicitly. We're certainly not anti-Christian at all. It's all it flows out of the underlying value that Sunshine Gospel Ministries, whose mission statement says that we exist to seek the renewal of the city through ministries of discipleship and mercy and justice. That's where Sunshine Enterprises came out of. But it is almost completely distinct 501c3. We're literally just waiting for the paper in the mail from the IRS. But we have a separate board, separate budget, separate staff, because Sunshine Enterprises focuses on disinvested neighborhoods throughout the city, whereas Sunshine Gospel Ministries focuses on young people in our neighborhood. So we've just realized that the lenses are different.
Well, and the
funding is totally different.
Easier to get BMO Harris or
That's exactly right. So all of J.P. Morgan Chase and BMO Harris and our local community foundations are all willing and eager to support equitable economic development, which is really what this kind of falls under. And so they all have come along to support Sunshine Enterprises in a way that they would never touch Sunshine Gospel. Yeah. So I would say in the same way that Green Line Coffee, our cafe, opened the world up to us, Sunshine Enterprises is actually doing something really similar, which has really been fun.
Where in the West Side are you?
Lawndale?
At Community Church?
No, we're not. We're at, I think it's called Above and Beyond. We're at a small center that's focused on reentry. Our main community partner is called New Covenant Community Development Corporation, but they're in a bank building that's not real visible to the street or anything like that. I couldn't even tell you what the address is offhand, but yeah. Their image is in our annual report. You could Google them. I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards.
Just really quick on what this real estate or property management stuff is.
Yes. So, we're at time, so I'm going to answer this as briefly as I can. Anybody who feels like they need to leave can certainly do that. When we started putting the cohorts together, we took, no matter what your business idea, you were all in the same cohort. 2 years ago, we started doing cohorts that were what we would consider specialty cohorts, meaning everybody in the room had kind of the same idea. So we now have 2 specialty cohorts in operation. One is property managers. Another is people who have a trade skill. So the observation from a local investor in our neighborhood was, since I said we identify people in the neighborhood who don't even know they're business owners, they don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs, and we help them to think of themselves that way, and then we help them to grow their business. And his observation was, the most stable business owner in your neighborhood is the lady who owns the 3-flat. And she doesn't think of herself as a business owner, and the SBA does not regard her as a business owner. But guess what? If you own and run a 3-flat as a business and you run it well, you can own another one. And so we've now taken about 100 people who are just property managers. Some of them already own the building. Others just they maybe live there for free but manage the building. And we're taking them through that. But we expect the real estate development portfolio that those folks are owning and managing to grow pretty exponentially. Actually, it's a pretty exciting group of folks to work with. So let me just stop officially there. Thanks for coming. I'll hang around for a little bit if there's questions.